So welcome everyone. I'm Diahann Billings-Burford, the CEO of RISE. We're not-for-profit and we're really committed to using the sports community to help our country address racism, improve race relations, and promote social justice. We're here for a really important conversation today. I thank everyone who is with us. As part of what we've been doing, we've been creating dialogues that we're sharing online in our RISE Digital Learning Series, and this is one of them. This one is focused on understanding empathy. We're going to talk about the definition of empathy, but we think empathy is a critical skill that's going to be necessary for our country to move forward. We think it's going to be critical in addressing racism and racial bias. We think it's critical in the national conversation between our law enforcement community and our communities of color. And so we're going to address that today, and I'm really grateful for everyone who's on this conversation with us. We are really privileged today that our conversation will be moderated by Bonnie Bernstein. Many of you will know her. She's an acclaimed journalist. You may have seen her on CBS and ESPN. And I just thank Bonnie for coming in because I'm excited for us to have an honest conversation. RISE prides itself on having real conversations. We do not require, nor do we encourage that everyone agree. We really encourage that everyone is honest so that we can move forward, we can move the needle, and we can make our world better. And so I thank Bonnie because your presence here, I think, is going to really enhance this conversation. We also have Dr. Andrew McIntosh, who leads our curriculum at RISE. And we think of him as an expert in this space of race, sport, and the intersectionality of both. And so with that, I turn it over to you, Bonnie. I'm excited for the conversation today. Like I said, I'm a girl from Brooklyn. I'm okay with a fight. I'm okay with an argument. I'll be fine when it's over. I'll be absolutely fine. So I encourage everybody to be really honest, and let's do some important work today.
I was born in Brooklyn and we know how to keep it real.
All the time.
So we are kindred spirits in that front. Diahann, thank you so much for the invitation. RISE calls these critical conversations, and there's a little part of me that thinks that they should be phrased critical and uncomfortable conversation. And the uncomfortable piece is where I think a lot of folks struggle, but where RISE thrives. And I love that today our conversation is going to revolve around understanding what empathy is, the differences between empathy and sympathy. And we have folks from 3 critical cities in Detroit and Chicago and Charlotte, where we're going to have folks from law enforcement and some wonderful athletes joining this program today to really have a well-rounded, critical, and probably at sometimes uncomfortable conversation. So let's get started. Diahann, you talked about empathy and how it will be a critical skill in addressing racism and improving relationships between law enforcement and their communities. So Dr. McIntosh, let's just start with a very simple question. What is the difference between sympathy and empathy?
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. I think that's a great question. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of someone else. So that's what empathy is. You know, when we see somebody who's sad, we're able to connect to the sadness that we have felt. Maybe not in the exact same scenario or situation, but we're able to connect to that emotion and share with that person that we understand and we see them and we get what they are going through. That is an empathic or empathetic response. Sympathy is more a cognitive process where we kind of intellectually acknowledge that that person is going through a tough time, but we aren't connecting with them in that emotional way. So empathy is truly important because it allows us to connect and build relationships with others. It makes us seem human. It's what gives us our humanity and allows us to connect with one another.
As we continue to have these uncomfortable conversations, I hear a lot of people saying, I want to be empathetic, but I've never been in a Black person's shoes. I've never had issues with law enforcement. How are we able to develop empathy if we haven't really experienced what we're trying to understand other people going through?
Yeah, being empathic or empathetic is about being able to take perspective, right? So can I put myself in somebody else's shoes and understand what they might be seeing versus the way that I see it? I think that's our critical first step. Another important step, though, is as you do that, to stay out of judgment, which can be tough, which can be difficult. If I don't necessarily see things the way you see things, I may have some judgment attached to that. But empathy is about saying, hey, can I hold on the judgment for the time being and just simply understand? The other piece of it, which is truly important, and I alluded to earlier, is the emotion part. So what are the emotions that this person is going through if they are truly, seeing things, viewing things, experiencing things in this way? What are the emotions attached to that? Can I find an emotion that's similar from a similar experience that I've had? And then I think one of the most important things, and this sometimes gets lost in the work that we do, is that you need to communicate that you have understood where that person is coming from, the emotions that they're experiencing, to that person. If you simply see things from their perspective, stay out of judgment, recognize their emotions, but you don't share that, then that connection isn't fostered, that connection isn't built. So communication is definitely a central part of the process in empathy.
So let's talk about actually putting empathy to work, because it is such an important part of RISE's entire proposition and mission statement, Diahann. So is there a personal anecdote you can share, something that you've experienced when you've been out in the field and partaking in and watching these RISE programs achieve and continue to evolve, that you can point to where you're like, this is how we bring empathy into play and this is how it's making a difference?
I would say one of the first times in my first year at RISE where I really became bought in that what we do is the right way to do things and that we can have an impact. I actually was in Detroit. The Detroit Police Athletic League team, young people were together. And while I and everyone else was sitting there being a little excited that the few of the Pistons came in and took part in the RISE session for that day, which was really around respect. We were initially happy to just have all the different parts of the community involved in the conversation. But one of the most powerful moments I had was when the session was over, a member of the police force, he was like, the reality is I never had a moment to ask a young person what respect looks like, right? Some of what we're doing in these conversations is trying to make things real for one another, understanding that everybody's just coming to the table as people with what they have and usually with the best of intentions. And just being candid, he said it never really dawned on me that from maybe the first two sentences of our interaction, asking this young teenage boy to either be a bitch, which is what he said, right? Or to cause a problem. And so for me, I thought it was great because actually he and I were talking about raising male, large, Black sons. And to me, I thought it was this great moment, right, of just realizing that even in the course of proper procedure, he might have been putting a young person in a position, almost a no-win position, given where they are in their development. And so for me, I felt like this is one of those moments where I think we moved the needle. I think most people, not everybody, let me correct that. Most people are coming to the table with the best of intentions, but we need to learn from one another. We need to really hear one another so that we can even get to that point of empathy.
I want to do a deeper dive on that. And Diahann, thank you for the perfect transition to bring in some of our other panelists, one of whom is Michael Richardson, who has taken part in RISE's amazing Building Bridges Through Basketball program. He's assigned to the Police Athletic League in Detroit. So Officer Richardson's joining us. Shannon Finis, who's with Charlotte PD, is also with us, as well as Officer Luis Crespo with Chicago PD. And we've also got two incredible athletes, Renee Montgomery, who's just a stud WNBA player, NCAA champion at UConn, has won 2 WNBA championships, and Jaiden Lars-Woodbey, who is a defensive back for Florida State, comes from about an hour outside of LA, and has been very active in the social justice space. So let's talk about the understanding that Diahann had the chance to bear witness to during this Building Bridges Through Basketball program in Detroit. Officer Richardson, Diahann talked about both sides understanding what respect looks like and how different that is for somebody in law enforcement versus a Black kid growing up and maybe not having relationships with law enforcement. What did you learn about how different respect looks like and how a bridge was built just through that conversation?
So really good question and really good observation by Diahann. And thank you all for having me. So for me, I think that's really important. Define those parameters of what those things mean, but particularly when you talk about respect. For me, I used to play a little football too, like Jaiden. And so for me, I'm a big Black male. And so before I was ever a police officer, that's what I get typecast as. And even now, as I walk through different places and I'm in regular clothes, and before kind of the movement that's going on now, you see people stay in their cars a little bit longer to let me walk by. You see people clutch their purse. I'm the safest person in any room. I've got to sacrifice my life if anything happens. But this is kind of the way that I'm looked at, by some folks. And so when you approach these young kids, for me, it's with the understanding that they're human first, and then they care about that badge and the uniform and things like that. So I come to them with a very human approach, and I find that when you have that uniform on, and this has happened to me a couple of times, you inadvertently are already sending a message to anyone that may have kind of a bad reference of police officers. I've spoken at some colleges, and they asked me to come, and I walked in and I had my uniform on and I said what I needed to say, and somebody stood up and said, by the fact that you're showing up here in that uniform, that already tells me what you already think. And I said, wow, this uniform speaks already. And so to be able to define what respect is, what it looks like, and even more than that, what disrespect is, and what it stems from in some of these neighborhoods and in the minds of some of these young people was something huge. Because to some of them, to approach them in a certain way, in a certain fashion, standing in a certain posture, wearing a certain thing, is immediate disrespect, even if you have the best intention.
That is so interesting, because honestly, I've never thought about that. The uniform and the badge can often create perception without any interaction, without any words being said. Luis and Shannon, as you've experienced the Building Bridges Through Basketball program, and you've had the opportunity to be on the court and have conversations with young folks in your communities, their coaches, what have you learned about how you present yourselves as you're trying to build bridges that maybe has you thinking differently? Maybe it's something as simple as, when you're out building bridges, not being in a uniform. I have no idea, but I'm throwing that question out there. Shannon, let's start with you.
I also run a basketball camp in the summer, and we do 2 mentoring groups based off that with the girls and boys. So for us, we have about 20 officers, and we meet them, and we'll go to their schools, we'll go to the games out of uniform, just to build that relationship first, meet them where they're at. Like Michael said, the human response. We have to be human with them to expect them to be human with us. So we've had a lot of success, I think, out of uniform initially, getting to know the kids, and then build from there and let them know, hey, we're police officers, and this is how to interact with us, and this is how we can be successful together. So that's where we've had success.
Luis, what have you learned about perception in versus out of uniform?
Apologize for that. Good afternoon, everyone. So I've had the advantage of being part of the program for quite some time now, and I've taken both perspectives, where I have come in uniform day one and I've come out of uniform day one. And being in uniform, there's this fear, I want to say, once you walk in, of it's kind of like your appearance commands respect, but it also kind of brings out the fear in the youth. And that when you walk in, any past experiences that they've had that were negative, all they see is that uniform, not the individual that's behind that uniform or in that uniform. And then when I've come out of uniform, they're just like, oh, he's just probably another coach. They're very social, outgoing. Who are you? What are you about? What neighborhood do you come from? And it isn't until the end that I let them know, well, I'm one of the officers.
And what's their reaction? What's their reaction when you say that?
That's a great question, because some of them will still be oh, okay, but he's one of the cool cops. And then someone will kind of be standoffish. We're like, oh, he's a police officer. So I get
It
both.
was really cool until he said he was a cop, right?
Right, exactly. So you definitely get different perspectives. And I think that each year it's different. So it's kind of a hit or miss, whether I go in uniform or without. It's kind of just a gamble to see how they're going to accept it.
So perception is so important. And sometimes I wonder if that creates friction without any sort of action at all. And I think to a certain degree, we are all a product of our environment. When it comes to the way we think about police officers, does that come from what our parents tell us, what our friends tell us, what we learn about when we're living in our everyday setting when we're kids, and we are very impressionable? Renee, you grew up in West Virginia. Jaiden, you grew up like in Fontana, which is about a little less than an hour east of LA. Is that right? When you were growing up, how were your opinions of law enforcement shaped by your surroundings? Jaiden, let's start with you.
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Jaiden Lars-Woodbey. I'm a defensive back here at Florida State University. But one of the main things, well, it's interesting because my uncle is actually a cop. So my uncle's been a cop for at least like 20 plus years. And I mean, honestly, I never really worried about law enforcement on my end because I grew up in a great community. You know, we grew up probably about like an hour and a half away from where both of my mom and my dad grew up. And just like comparing my lifestyle compared to my mom and my dad is just so different. Like my dad, he grew up in Watts, which is like a sub-city in LA. And, you know, he's seen multiple friends, you know, get killed, get murdered. Some of them, you know, get into altercations with police and end up losing their life. So, you know, my dad, he has a very different perception of the police. And, you know, I think part of the reason that my uncle became a police is to stop certain things like that from happening in his area. But one of the main things when I grew up was, you know, just is always show respect in order to gain respect. And that was one thing that I've always stood by and that I've always went by. And, you know, as I've grown up and as I've seen things on social media and as I've seen things and heard stories from certain friends who lived in different neighborhoods, you know, it's just, even though it's never happened to me, it has instilled that it's not fear, but just awareness. You know, whenever you see a cop now, you know, even though I haven't had one of those encounters with a police officer, you know, in the back of my head, I always think, you know, it could always be you. Like, don't ever think it can't happen to you. So that's my perspective from, you know, the law enforcement aspect. But I mean, even now, you know, it's subtle things like when I see a police car, when I'm driving my car, I don't pass him. Like, I'll wait until he turns left or if he turns right, or I'll go to another street without even knowing, you know. And as I've done more research about everything that's going on, you know, in the world today, you know, I caught on to certain things that I do, you know, and that's one of the things, like avoiding, you know, interactions with the police. Even though I'm a respectful young man, you know, I just try my best sometimes to avoid. And then, you know, I end up thinking like, man, you know, I shouldn't do that. But at the same time, I understand, you know, certain things that I see and certain experiences that I hear from others, you know, that kind of mold that perception.
Renee, we're going to talk about your journey in making a difference in the social justice space as this conversation goes on. But what about you? What was it like growing up in West Virginia? And what was the conversation like, whether it was with family members or friends of yours when it came to law enforcement and maybe racism related to that?
Yeah, so, you know, it was different. At 12, I'm just using that example because I have a 12-year-old, but at 12, we didn't talk about the cops. Like, you know, it wasn't a thing in our household. We didn't have to have that sit down conversation. It was not exposed to me that early. And so that's the first thing that pops in my mind because I've had a talk with my 12-year-old about like, you know, he jokes around a lot and he's very silly. And I had to like let him know, like, I love that you're silly. You're just like me in a sense of you're silly and I get it. But I had to tell him there's a time and a place to be silly. You know, like it's not everybody doesn't look at you as a kid that's joking. And I had to have that conversation with him. And so the reason I say that is because, you know, growing up in West Virginia, you know, a lot of people have heard me say now it's a 3.6% Black population in my city. That's a very small population. Even still in that population, I never had to have the conversation at 12 that I had to have with my 12-year-old. So I just think, I don't know if it's necessarily my parents were trying to shield me from that conversation. I didn't encounter as much racism as people might assume. I just felt a lot of awkwardness. Growing up, I was very uncomfortable a lot of times because I was the only Black person in my elementary school. You know, that's uncomfortable in junior high when we talk about Black History Month and I'm the only Black student in the class. You know, that's an uncomfortable feeling. So growing up in West Virginia gave me a perspective of, you know, what white America is like because I was submerged in that culture. So I think it gives me a different view.
Well, places like Chicago and Detroit have a little more than a 3.5% Black population. To be honest, Officer Finis, I don't know what that percentage is in Charlotte, but when we talk about racism and law enforcement, I think our attention immediately comes to police being racist against people in the community. We can tackle that in a minute, but I'm curious, when you look within your own law enforcement forces, what does racism look like to you? Shannon, let's start with you.
Well, we're really kind of seeing it now, I think, even with what's going on outside in the community. With our own officers, I've had several conversations with Black officers that are having a really hard time because the thing the white officers are saying about what's going on out there. So they're questioning where they stand with white officers in the department, and that's tough. And I've seen things in our department. I've been here for 7 years now, and it's been from command down, where they're doing things based on race, like negative actions based on race in our department. So it's definitely here, it's definitely within. So if it's within, it's in the community too. So we have to be able to tackle that here, I think, before we can tackle it in the community.
We're fortunate enough to have in the Chicago Police Department a very diverse department, and within my immediate surroundings and my colleagues, we're very diverse in race. So we do have these, especially more recently than before, these conversations with racism. It's a topic of conversations affecting us, you know, globally. It's something we have to deal with on a daily basis. We can't ignore it. We can't go around it. We can act like it doesn't exist. I think the open form of communication, being as blunt, honest in our environment as possible, so that we could, you know, just relate to one another or try to understand where a certain race or demographics is coming from, has been very beneficial for us.
Michael, on a scale of 1 to 10, when you look at the diversity of the Detroit police force, what is that percentage white versus Black and brown?
So I would say if I had to break it up, we're probably looking at maybe 55%, maybe Black and brown. But as the city is kind of on the comeback or gentrifying, as some people would say, the faces in the department are changing. I agree with what Shannon said. There are a lot of times where as officers, like your occupation is the same, but your culture and your values are a lot different. And so you do maybe see some cliques. You do maybe see people over on this side of the room talking and this side of the room talking. We're talking about the same things, but totally different outcomes, totally different perspective. And when you hear somebody, for instance, let's say I've got some folks that are white officers that I know they're great people. We've talked, we've hung out, and they may say, well, all he had to do was do what they said, what they told him, and things like that. And then maybe you think, well, he should have never been in a situation where he was compromised and out of the car in the first place. And so now you start to create we're all looking at the same law, the same procedure, trained the same way, but now our mental and cultural mindset is pouring into the conversation. And it does in some spaces create a little bit of division and some of that bias. For me, one of the most frustrating situations that I can remember when we're talking about this topic is back when Mike Brown, the police officer that was being tried for him, was going through the trial, and everything wasn't televised as much as it is now, but there was a big tension around law enforcement and what's going on. Finally, the verdict came out. The police officer was found not guilty. And I was in a room full of police officers at the time. And I was, I think, maybe the only Black person in the room. And everybody erupted, yeah, yeah. A victory for law enforcement. And for me, as, again, a Black man first, and then law enforcement is my occupation, I had very mixed feelings about it. And so just those types of situations, I think when your humanity mixes with that badge, it really creates kind of an interesting space sometimes.
Well, we talked about respect early in the conversation. How challenging is it to foster that sort of respect between races, even within precincts?
For me, I guess I'll start on this one. For me, I think the respect naturally exists, because I think this profession is something that we all look at each other and we say, man, hey, I know you got my back, when it comes down to the professionalism of it. But then again, when we start to go into some of these conversations and introduce some of our implicit bias, we start to see some of the selection for units. So let's say maybe there's a cyber unit, and you start to see, wow, man, a lot of Black guys have been putting in for it, but only white guys are getting put in that unit. Then you see the drug units. You say, wow, well, some white guys are getting putting in for it, but only the Black guys are getting picked for that unit. And so, so you start to see those kinds of things. And in your mind, when somebody kind of explains it to you, they can, put some reference of context with it that makes you, pacifies whatever it is. But I think a lot of folks go home thinking, man, is there anything fair? and so I think that happens a lot. But I think the respect part, as far as like actually being in the precinct, it comes from the job. And it's kind of one of those things where it's yours to lose. You don't really have to gain it. You have it, and it's yours to lose based on your actions and how you conduct yourself.
Officer Finis, I'm a huge fan of anecdotes and examples. So let's take this concept of empathy, and here's reality. We all evolve as life goes on. We all evolve in our approach to challenging situations as we learn and listen. As you continue to learn about empathy and how that concept helps improve the dynamic between law enforcement and community, can you think of an example of how you would handle something with empathy now that you would approach differently if you were dealing with that situation before you were starting to have these sorts of real critical conversations?
Yeah, so I'll just give an example from a basketball camp that we run. We had a young man show up. He had an ankle monitor on, so immediately there's 25 cops there. We're all looking at his ankle and trying to figure out why he's got that on. And not only did he have that on, and that was kind of something we were looking at, he was also too old to be there because he had graduated high school. So our camp is for high school students only. But it just something hit my heart that maybe he needed to be there, and he shouldn't be out. He has an ankle monitor on for a reason. I don't know what it is, but maybe he needed to be here with us this week. It's an overnight camp. We can keep him out of trouble, figure out what's going on. And the first day we had a little rough time. Officers got into it with him, but we had conversations like, hey, he's here for a reason. Let's figure it out. And by the end of the week, he's our star camper. Everybody loved him. He got along great with the officers, but he was a leader with all the kids too, because we gave him that opportunity. And then after that, we worked with him through court and got him a job and got him back on track and everything. So it was just a situation where we had this kid that kind of got in trouble. And we could have said, no, you can't come to camp because you have that on and you're a bad kid. But we took a chance on him, and it ended up being beneficial for him, but for all the officers involved too, because they learned to take a chance on a kid and try to fit his shoes and figure out what was going on with him. And now they can do that with other kids too. So
definitely. And again, it's knowledge and experience and training and education. It's a huge component to all of that. Through my experience in my career, I probably would have rushed judgment. I would have been younger, not so much adapted to listening to someone and hearing them. I wanted to quickly control the situation, figure out an answer for both parties, and move on with my day, rather than actually taking the time out and listening. And I think gauging through experience and education, people want to be heard. And if long as you sit there and listen to both parties, sometimes that's all it takes. But if you don't give those parties the opportunity and a fair chance to explain both sides and come to a happy median, then there's where we're having a lot of problems, I believe. And in my beginning of my career, and prior to all this wonderful experiences that I've had with this program, I would have been very quick to judge. Let's get this over with. What's your problem? What's your problem? I'm going to tell you how we're going to handle this, and we're going to go on our way. And that necessarily isn't always the best answer. So it's wonderful to have programs like this, have conversations with different facets of the community, as well as, nationally, so that we can pick each other's brains and find out, okay, what works for you? Maybe it didn't work for me, but it could work for somebody else.
Shannon, tell me a little bit more about how you constructed that conversation. Because yeah, you invited him in and he became a star, but the initial part of that conversation could have been confrontational, like, okay, we think you probably shouldn't be here. What's the deal? Or tell me a bit about yourself. What are you hoping to get out of it? I wasn't there, but tell me about the conversation and how it took him off the defense and opened him up to really be the best he could be in that environment.
Well, initially I sat him down and just had a conversation to figure out why he had that on, and then invited him to camp. And then it wasn't even an hour that he got into it with the officer, because the officer we're doing drills and the officer was trying to tell him how to do the drills, but immediately he didn't like being told what to do. So I had to sit him down and say, look, this is a camp. We're here to coach you. We're here to teach you and show you different things. And he didn't like that a man was telling him what to do. And then it ended up being a white officer too. So that took a whole different turn. So we had to have a conversation with him about why that bothered him and why he took defense right away. And we just kept, then I picked an officer to work with him throughout camp and just kind of mold him and make sure that he was doing everything he needed to do and he was comfortable. So it just, I don't know, we got lucky. It ended up working out and being good for everybody involved.
It wasn't luck though. It was you guys making a commitment to continuing to have the conversation, providing that platform of trust and helping him understand, quite frankly, that he was in a safe space. And I think that's really valuable insight to share. Renee and Jaiden, one of the things that I love most about Rise is, sure, there are a lot of high profile athletes who are involved in this program, but simply the fact that you are athletes puts you in a really strong leadership position just by virtue of all of the skill sets that we develop as athletes. So when you look at all of the different leadership skills, what is it about your experience as athletes to this point that has you now in the position to truly lead in the social activism space? Renee, let's start with you.
Yeah, so for me in 2019, I started my foundation, and let me backtrack and act like I have some home training. Thank you, Bonnie, for leading this chat, and Diane for bringing me in on this, because I'm a big person. I'm big on conversations matter, as Bonnie said. So thank you guys for bringing me in on this uncomfortable conversation. I would say, I started my foundation in 2019, and the mission statement was to spread positivity through the things I learned in sports. That's confidence, that's teamwork, that's leadership, and that's discipline, different things like that. Because look, I've been playing basketball since I was 10. I've been playing it serious since I was about 15 when I went to USA basketball camp. So I've been at the highest level since I was young. So I learned things young, how to communicate. I learned how to talk to people in a high pressure situation. We have to find a solution quick. We don't have a lot of time how do you feel about it? So I have to figure out how to talk to people the right way and get my message across and they don't get offended. And again, this is in between games, in between timeouts, small windows. So now when I take a different role, when I step off of the court and I want to be a leader in this activism role, I use those exact same things. I'm looking at situations. A lot of people ask me about, my situation here with my team, and we have a team owner. I'm looking at it the same way I look at it on the court. Like, all right, we got to figure out a solution. We got to figure out a common ground. We have this commonality here. Let's move from that. So I talked to my co-owner who was opposed, and the backstory is she was opposed to the WNBA getting involved in Black Lives Matter, getting involved in anything political. She wanted to keep the politics out of sports. So I'm thinking like, all right, well, what do we have in common? Well, we're both women, we're both women in sports. So I started to think about that, and I wrote an open letter on Medium talking about, look, in 1919, when we were fighting for women's suffrage, and I wasn't born yet, but there were women fighting for women's suffrage, we would have been the same. Like, we would have been side by side, like, yeah, we need to vote. What's good? Like, that would have been us. But because now it's a fast forward to another movement, this movement isn't about women voting. We would have been partners then. But this movement is about civil rights, and this movement is about the Black community. I'm saying we still need to stand together in that aspect. So I would say just in sports, I learned how to find the common ground and work from there.
You said 6 words that are so critical. How do you feel about it? And sometimes I think asking that simple question, saying, I'm invested in wanting to understand how you feel, like this isn't a one-way conversation. Those 6 words say this is a 2-way conversation, and that can totally change the dynamic. So thank you for sharing that, Renee. Jaiden, the fact that you come from a family where your uncle is a cop, and you're in a really prominent football program, and you kicked butt in high school football in one of the most fertile hotbeds of football in California. Like, to me, you're just like this mix of awesomeness when it comes to being able to lead as a social activist. What is it about everything that you are as a human being that you feel empowers you to truly make a difference in this space?
One of the biggest things that I feel like gives me a power in this space is just knowing that everybody has an opportunity to change the world and to change the environment around them. So one of the things that my parents always told me when I was little, and I never really understood it until I got to college, was, that I'm different, and that I'm a very outgoing person, and that I need to use that in the right way. So one thing that I've always loved to do is just learn and just understand different perspectives and be able to inspire others, not only on the football field, but just in the classroom and in life in general. And, seeing all of the injustices and all of these different things that are going on throughout the world, one of the main things that I wanted to do is not only provide myself insight, but provide my teammates insight, provide my, my friends and families and followers and stuff, on my social media insight about, different perspectives. So one of the things that I truly got from it was just understanding both sides. And I honestly I got a great feel of that after I got injured, because I've seen so many people have season-ending injuries on my high school team and even in college. But once it happened to me, and once I had to actually go through that process of not being able to play while others could, going through a deep depression, understanding like, man, like, will I ever be able to play football again? Or, man, will I ever be able to do this again? And going through the grind of recovery and just, doing those things, it helped me understand, a different side of life and a different side of football. And I feel like that helped me in the activism part as well, because like I said, not all of these things that you've seen on social media have happened to me, but I know somebody who it's happened to, and possibly a family member who's it happened to as well. So just me being able to truly understand and try to figure out a way where I can help them, or try to understand it to where it can make me better as a person, I think that helped me out a great deal.
Louis, Shannon, Michael, you have all seen up close and personal the role that sports can play in creating a stronger, positive dynamic among law enforcement and communities. If you could cite an example of how that's worked, whether it's bringing players into the fold, bringing coaches into the fold, having those conversations, dispatching them out into the communities to help create a better, stronger understanding. What does that look like to you from your vantage point? Officer Richardson, let's start with you.
So that's a really great question. I think I'm in Detroit Police Department. I'm positioned really well to be able to kind of have a direct hand in that. I work with Police Athletic League, so we focus on sports and young people specifically. And for me, what I found is kind of roping in all the folks you just mentioned, roping in coaches. Parents are huge. And what you find out is a lot of the young people we serve in some of these underserved communities come from one-parent households, or they have a guardian rather than a parent. But having a support system that is also supported through other resources is one thing. But plugging in those coaches, some of these young people and some of these athletes, they only will listen to their coaches. It doesn't matter. They've got a culture that if a police officer says this, or if it's just some man or just some lady, then it doesn't mean anything to me. But if a coach says it, it's just as good as as if it were written in the good book. So it's really interesting to see that dynamic. But I think kind of what we touched on before, the biggest piece I've seen to really be impactful is when they can connect with you as a human. When you go out there and you can throw the ball with them, when you can just have good conversation about some of their favorite video games, the latest songs that are out, and some of those things. And it's really interesting because as Renee and Jaiden were talking and Shannon was telling her story, it reminded me of a time that there was a young man, he got pulled over. He was, I guess he, was kind of swerving back and forth, just trying to be cool, blast his music, pulled him over, came up to him, and he was just a really good guy. But you could see his knees were kind of close to his chest, and he didn't have his license plate and all this stuff. So I asked him to get out of the car. I'm 6'1". This guy started getting out of the car, and he just kept going and going and going and going and going. The guy was like 6'7" or something like that. But I just saw him as an athlete. And by me having been an athlete, like just, outside of the uniform, he just reminded me of a friend. He reminded me as a person, not as a threat, not as somebody that's bigger or stronger or taller, just a guy. And so I think connecting on that human level is always the first kind of line of defense. But then having that other support system around folks, like Shannon said, people that are able to plug into specific youth and maybe can, speak from their realm of experience and really get them rolling in the right direction. All those are tools, I think, that work together.
You have a little bit of an advantage because you can be like, you're what, six something? Shannon, I would imagine the dynamic's a little bit different for you. So what's your approach when you have the opportunity to be around players and coaches and understanding how sports sort of fosters a whole group of young leaders? How has that been helpful for you?
Well, sports were pretty much started to start community, right? Like you had your little clubs a long time ago, and that was community based. You're trying to build your community. So I think that we can still do that here. I was fortunate to have played college basketball and had great coaches and great teammates. And then I did a little coaching myself. So I've always had that, I guess, way to be able to talk to anybody. So I usually treat situations like this that we're a team, just that team aspect and bring everybody in. And we're fortunate in Charlotte that we have our last few chiefs have been very community oriented. So we have a great PAL program. We have a lot of great programs, and a lot of it's around sports. It's just easier to relate to people with sports because it's that team family bond that you just can create off the bat and build from there.
When you say, expand on that, when you say you approach challenging situations as a coach, give me an example of that.
So just like as a mentor, like Michael was saying, a lot of the kids don't have a support system. So I'll take on that role as more of a mentor than an officer. So when we're getting out with kids, that's just how I'll talk to them, like I'm their coach or their teacher, not a police officer. And you just kind of get a different, they kind of look at you funny, like, why are you talking to me like a friend or a mentor instead of an officer? I don't approach them with the, we're gonna arrest you right away or do this, depending on the situation, obviously. But most of the time, I just approach from a level of I try to meet them at their level. And a level of respect is like a mentor, and give them a little lesson to lead with instead of taking them with me.
Luis, is there a way to draw parallels between empathy in sports and empathy in the law enforcement community dynamic?
Definitely, I think there is. I think that bridge, in order to make that happen, it's going to be a team effort. I think that the other officers had some very good key points on that team effort, and that being the camaraderie, respect, along with fostering their families and whatever support group they have to come in, because I truly believe that this does start at home. Some individuals, some young athletes don't have the dynamics or the model home atmosphere that most people would call and consider a regular father, mother environment. But again, us talking to them, not at them, and maybe filling that gap or void, relating to them one-on-one as a person, breaking down barriers through these sports, and then through conversations. Day one, they're very standoffish, they're not very respectful, and it works both sides. But by the last week, we're giving high fives, we're giving hugs, you see tears in their eyes, and you could tell there's a certain transition. I can't put a week on it, that barrier just goes down, and it's like, it's no longer the, hey officer, how's it going, how you doing? It's more like, hey man, glad to see you, glad you're here. It's not a form of disrespect, it's more of a form that I think we've gotten to the point that we've broken down some of those barriers. Maybe they understand a little bit more about us, and we can understand a little bit more about them.
Is there a moment you can think of? Because I would imagine you, as somebody who's trying to break down barriers, you're like, you see the light switch, you see something turn, you see that bridge, that moment where you can tell a bridge is being built. Is there one of those moments that resonates most with you?
It gets me kind of emotional because it happens literally at every year. There's either one young athlete who is just very challenging to break down and work in a program, or doesn't want to go along with it, or is always that last one to participate, or always has something to say under his breath. And then it's different for each young athlete. But then you just see where it kind of just went away. It's almost like day and night, where you're like, what happens to that person? Where did that one kid go that was so tough and rough, and now he's giving you a hug and saying, hey, I'll see you next week, right? You're going to be here, right? Or if you're late or you happen not to make it because of other responsibilities, they sure give it to you, where before they wouldn't care. Like, he didn't make it, no big deal. Now they're like, well, where are you? Where were you? How come you weren't here? How come you didn't show up? I was looking for you. I wanted to see you. That's when you know that you made that difference, that this whole program and what we're looking for in future as a society, that we've actually gained it with these young athletes. And it's different every time with every group. So I really wish I could pinpoint it. I wish I could lay it out, say, hey, let's follow this format or platform, but each person's different. And I think that's what makes it so special.
I just want to share there. Thank you, Crespo. So let me say, one thing I think is great is, like, I've been to Chicago year one. We were in LA together when we won the ESPY award for this program. And then again last year. And to your point and to what Shannon and Michael both said, I think one of the things that is important for us at RISE is we are not only trying to exercise empathy on the side of the young person, but we are also in having the officers be the ones that in many instances are leading the sessions, building empathy on both sides. And so when we hear all three of these law enforcement officers speak, I think one thing that's really important to note is that they are all actually empathizing with the young people that they are actually talking about. They know about these young people. They think they should ask about them. They think they should know details about them. They see multiple points of the young people's identity. And so I think it's worth pointing out, because if we're gonna overcome some of these challenges, it really does have to be this empathy both ways. And I think we are focusing on the young people, and that's good, but the officers here are displaying this wonderful empathy that is going on. And that's really what's necessary to build the trust that leads you to the relationships that Luis is talking about. So like when I walked in that gym at NBA All-Star Weekend, where we launched, and unfortunately, like you said, Shannon, we launched it that week and then we had to stop it in both cities. But when you walk in, it's a community. And the truth is, it's not just a community because the kids understand the cops. It's a community because the kids understand the cops and the cops understand the kids, and trust is being built because there's empathy going both ways. And so I just think it's important to say that because this works when the law enforcement officers that step into these programs understand they got to build some empathy too, right? And they get at it, and that really makes the difference.
Diahann, as somebody who watches these programs from start to finish, community, I would imagine that conceptually community is the goal, but over that 10-week period, community is something that is built. It's not a guarantee day one when all the law enforcement folks and all the kids walk in. Is that a fair statement, that you see community building, and when that 10-week program wraps up, that ideally is what is achieved?
Absolutely, and we think it's step one of that is achieved, right? Like RISE, we see ourselves as partners, we push in, we bring this curriculum, but our success for us is a relationship that outlasts our intervention, right? So when we come back, right, like it should be like when I walked into the Boys and Girls Club in Chicago, right? Like the community did not stop. The kids that were in our video, you know, Under Armour made this slick video for us. That was great for the video, but the relationship has to outlast it. So when I see you next year, you can see that relationship has gone deeper. And again, that's success to us because it comes down to meaningful relationships. It comes down to people seeing each other as individuals. I love that Jaiden's description of interaction with the police and Renee's are totally different than mine, right? Like it's relationships with individuals that may share the same ethnicity, may share the same race, but really actually very different people. And so success for us, yes, is that seeing those real relationships built on individuality that last over time.
Well, RISE is a shining example of what's possible when you have groups of people who are committed to change and evolving together, and the net result of that is community and sustainable. We know that. Diahann, at the end of the session, I'm going to ask you to share some information that RISE has gleaned through its case studies. And this is all amazing, but the reality is there's so much work to be done. There's been a lot of conversation about George Floyd's death. And sometimes I find myself saying, this is statement season. It's statement season. Let's make sure that once this isn't a part of our 24, 48, however long the news cycle is, that there's real action going on. And Renee and Jaiden, that's why I have such an appreciation for what the two of you are doing. Renee, growing up in a community in West Virginia where you didn't have run-ins with the cops, you didn't have conversations as a 12-year-old like you have your son, and yet you have decided that you're going to put this WNBA season on the back burner to focus on social justice initiatives. I don't think it's a coincidence that you were part of Lynx teams that Maya Moore was also a part of, and she spent a couple of years doing incredible work in the social justice space. And Jonathan Irons was just released from prison on July 1st after 20 some odd years in prison for not committing a crime. But why? Why are you taking time away to focus your energy in the social justice space?
Yeah, so, you know, Officer Finis, is it Shannon Finis? She said, you know, take a chance. And when I first opted out, I was just taking a chance. I saw that something needed to be fixed. There was a string of tragedies. We all know Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, as you talked about. And it was those string of tragedies that it was just like, what is going on? Like, I think we all had that same feeling of, it's like, yo, lots going on right now in America, and this moment right here is very important. So I was more so focused on this moment and not necessarily my basketball season. So every time people would ask me, hey, are you excited for the season? I would be like, oh my goodness, I haven't even been thinking about it like that. So that I would have to generate, you know, just the politically correct answer. Like, you know, of course I'm excited. I love basketball, but I hadn't thought about it. It's not that I don't love basketball. So while those were true statements, my main focus was, what can I do to try to have an impact? And then, you know, I talk a lot about moments equaling momentum. And when I say moments equal momentum, it means like this moment right here in time is different than anything, you know, my parents have seen, like their parents have talked about. You know, I've talked to the older generation just to see like, yo, are we kind of doing the same thing y'all are doing, or what's different, you know? And they tell me the diversity of this movement is what's different. You know, the sympathy of this movement, the empathy of this movement. We talk about both of those. There's a lot of that coming from not just concerned citizens in the brown and black community, but from organizations. You hear the NBA talking about it. You hear the NFL. If an organization is not talking about it, then they're going to have that peer pressure of, excuse me, where do you stand? You know, like, so now this is a different time than there's ever been in history. So I wanted to take this moment and extend it as far as I can. Because if we're being realistic, after the seasons, after, you know, all the sports are done and it's next season, these companies might not be asking the same question. Mississippi might not be wanting to change their flag, but now we're glad we got it done now. You know, a lot of these schools are getting their names changed. I mean, that might not happen 9 months from now, but it's happening right now. You see an NFL team in Washington, they have to change their actual name. Now, there's been the Native American community has been complaining about their name since 1968 is the first time they submitted their first resolution about that. It got changed in 2020. Why? Because of this movement and because of this moment. So that's the reason that I stepped away from basketball for this season, because this moment and this movement is that important.
It's a great point, and it's not just sports organizations. Equally as important, it's brands. And brands, quite frankly, is the reason why they're going to have to change their name, because there have been a lot of brands who were standing up and being bold about their company message, lending itself to Black Lives Matter. On the action front, Renee, what do you hope to do?
Yeah, so I'm really excited. So there's two different initiatives that I want to do. One is involving the voting campaign. And everybody hears that and they're like, oh gosh, don't get political. I'm not. So the voting campaign is strictly educational on what is a Democrat, what is a Republican. You know, I read an article the other day and they said that they polled people and asked who is the commander in chief, and a lot of people didn't know. And it's not to make fun of people, it's that politics are not necessarily taught thoroughly at the adult age. So the campaign that I'm going to do, remember the 3rd November, it's going to be strictly on educational base. What do you need when you get to the polls? What can they not turn you away if you have? How are you going to get there? You know, you see State Farm Arena opening up. You know, the Hawks opened up State Farm Arena as a polling location. That's huge because now people can come, they can social distance. Public transit gets you right to the door of an arena. So that's the first thing. Remember the 3rd November. And the second thing is called the Last Yard. And a lot of people right now, HBCUs need the most attention. You see a lot of different universities, they're shutting down programs for sporting programs. They're shutting down creative programming. And you see the powerhouse schools doing that. Imagine the HBCUs that didn't have the funding to begin with. So I'm focusing on the HBCUs, and it's called the Last Yard because a lot of students drop out between that $100 and $1,000 range. Like they just can't, it's tuition, books, whatever that little leftover is, they just can't figure it out and they have to drop out of school. To me, that's unacceptable. So we want to help and give grants. And so I'm going to be doing a fundraiser for that and Morris Brown. And this is a quick story for that. Morris Brown is the only college founded by a slave. 20 years ago, their president wasn't doing well with the financials. They lost their accreditation. But 17 months ago, they were on the path to get it back. They had a $3 million debt that they zeroed out. They got their accreditation loan, and now they just need some funds to show that they can function and sustain as a running business. So I'm going to be banging a drum loud and starting a fund where people can donate for that to save Morris Brown. So when people ask me, how will you know if you were successful? I think, you know, people need like a marker. So if we save Morris Brown, I say we because it's going to need a lot of help. If we save Morris Brown, I think I would have won a championship this season. So that's what I'm excited about. That's what I'm doing. And everybody's always asking, how are you doing? I'm like, I'm great. I'm energized. Like we're doing things here. So that's that's my excitement. I'm excited about what's happening.
Your energy's coming through the screen. If you mass produce that and bottle it and put it on a Walmart shelf, I think we'd all be better for it. Jaiden, I want to talk for a sec about the power of the college student athlete right now, because as Renee had alluded to, this movement being more powerful than it's ever been, I think that notion is applicable to college student athletes too. what have you observed in the last couple of months, specifically what you and some of your teammates on the football team at FSU have been able to achieve that is and feels different than what you were used to seeing growing up and watching other college athletes?
I would say one of the biggest things that I've seen is that we conducted a march, like I want to say like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and honestly, it was amazing to watch because, you know, everybody on the team, you know, we got on one accord and we decided to march down a couple of streets in Tallahassee. And in my head, I was just thinking like, man, like I've never been to a march before. You know, my grandma's been to one and I've always wanted to go to one, and I get an opportunity to do one and be a part of the change. And I was just thinking like, man, this probably wouldn't have been able to happen like 2 or 3 years ago. And one of the biggest things that I see now is a lot of times athletes, especially at the college level, they do have a lot of things that they want to get off their chest about certain things, but they're always condemned and to a small space, and they're not able to really voice their opinion, you know. And especially like if you're not a prominent football player, or if you're not a starter, or if you're not this, or if you're not that, you know, you can't really have a say, which I feel like got nipped in the butt this year, you know. And I think that was a big fear. But once we started to see a lot of people of power at the next level in the NFL, in the NBA, and, you know, just starting to see them be able to voice their opinion and say how they truly felt, I think that it trickled down to the college level and gave us some type of power. And now if one person feels this way and we inform all of our other teammates, and we're like, man, we all feel this same way too. You know, now we truly understand the power that we have. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we had an incident where, you know, a coach, he might have misspoke on something, and, you know, it got around the team, and we ended up boycotting workouts for like 2 days, and it messed up their whole schedule, like everything. And we just sat back and we're just like, man, like that's crazy. You know, it just shows how much power we have. You know, like everybody got on one accord and we were just able to get this done. But I think the biggest thing that we got out of it was like, man, like we do have a voice. Like, even though we say we do have one, it's like when you actually do it, you're like, man, like, no, we really, really do. And, you know, I posted a video regarding the conversation that we had as a football team and just on the injustices. And I had a lot of positive feedback, more than I actually thought I would have, you know, just going around campus. And, you know, I had like a on-campus job, like everybody on the team goes to this little on-campus job. And, you know, somebody mentioned to me, you know, they never seen the perspective that I was talking about in my video. And by them looking at it and them doing their own research, which I encouraged in the video, you know, it opened up a lot of doors and a lot of things that they've never seen before. And, you know, just even with my teammates, you know, just posting everything that I post on my social media, you know, I have a lot of questions from my teammates, and I'm just like, man, like, I can't believe you don't know about this, but let me help educate you. Let me help show you where you can find this information. And I feel like that's the power that every athlete has, and that I felt like I noticed this year, just based on everything that's going on.
That's such a diplomatic way to handle it. And I wanted to say that because that's important when we talk about, you know, how you talk to people. And instead of you guys going to Instagram and being crazy, which you could have done, and you could have been validated in doing that, but instead you guys like moved as a unit. So I think that's important because I think there's strength in numbers and a whole team. You know what I mean? Football, it's not like basketball where, you know, we got 12 people on my team. So to get 12 people together, that's like nothing. I'm just calling people like, yo, tell your friend, and it's done in 10 minutes. This is a football team, and that's important because now they see that you're not moving, you know, you're moving smartly. You know, you're moving as a unit, you're moving as a whole, and you have demands. So I just wanted to commend you guys. Like I didn't know that story beforehand, but wow, Jaiden, like that's awesome. Sorry to cut you off, Bonnie, but that is like really awesome to hear that college students took that step and planned before they made a move. Because most people, they see it, they're like, wait, what? And they're like Twitter fingers and they go crazy, but they actually planned it out and took the time to plan it out. So to me, that's actually like, that's next level for college students to do. That shows the maturity.
That's really well said. And to me, there's two pieces to that. So it's what Renee touched on keeping your dirty laundry in the locker room. But the other piece is, okay, that's a conversation. You have a boycott, you accomplish what you want. But then there were action items attached to that, tangible action items that can be shared on a broader scale. Your team has made a collective decision to register to vote, to raise money to help Black kids go to college, to do more to help kids in underserved communities. So I think that's amazing, Jaiden. But you know, I want to try to circle and bring this back to the law enforcement piece, because there's still a gap there and there's a lot to be done between officers and community. So whether it's you personally or the conversations you're having with your teammates, now that you know that you can take your voice and put power behind it, how do you feel you can make a difference in building that bridge between the cops and the community?
One of the things that we did as a university is we have this Zoom, I think every Thursday around 5 or 6 o'clock, and it's called Open Arms, Open Ears. And pretty much we have law enforcement, we have, lawyers, we have people that are in, the Capitol, we have coaches, we have everybody in these Zoom meetings. And, we just learn more and more about just different perspectives and different sides. But one of the main things that I always brought up was, doing a ride along. I feel like that'll go a long way. And, just questions behind how or what it takes to become a police officer. And there's one of our campus police officers, I was asking them a lot of questions. And one of the main things that I always asked them was, I think that we should go through a day where we go through the training of a police officer just to see what it is, and maybe, just get a different perspective on what it's like to be a police officer. And, I asked a lot of uncomfortable questions, and, I felt like the first couple of meetings that we had, I told them, I was like, man, I feel like you guys are just doing this stuff just to check it off the checkbox.
What was one of the most uncomfortable questions you asked? Do you remember?
Yeah, one of the most uncomfortable questions I asked was, are we willing as a university to go out on a limb and do what other universities are not able or don't want to do in order to help the Black athletes on the football team or on any other team? Just being able to stand up and actually say, Black Lives Matter, actually, be on our side. Even if we're going to lose money from boosters, get threats from all these different people, are you guys willing to stand by our side in that aspect and not just be always politically correct and worry about losing a dollar?
Who did you ask that question to, Jaiden? Who that direction directly asked you?
I asked it to our athletic director. And, at first, it was a political answer. And then, after I asked it again, he said that he was willing to do it. So, now we're figuring out ways where we can actually do certain things to help with that. And yeah, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I just feel like if I do a ride along, and I feel like if a lot of people on our team, if we set that up to where we can do ride alongs with the police officers, it'll help bridge that gap. And one thing I was also proposing is maybe we should, instead of just understanding what it's like to go through it, if they have something to where we can actually do it ourselves, where we can actually just go through a day or go through a camp or a program where we can do something like that. Because I feel like the best way to know something is to actually experience it yourself. One thing my dad used to tell me all the time is I could tell you that the stove is hot and I could tell you that it can burn you, but if you actually experience it yourself, then you'll actually know what I'm talking about. And I just feel like that's the same, the same thing when it comes to this.
Well, if you could get David Coburn to agree to having everybody's back, regardless of what boosters say, that will be monumental progress. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because the reality is that is one of the biggest challenges in college athletics. I think athletics directors always want to do the right thing, but sometimes because donors contribute so much money, they're worried about potential fallout there. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to be super mindful of time. We've got about 9 minutes before the top of the hour. So our police friends, I would love to throw it back to you before we have Diahann have some closing remarks. Where do we go from here? We've seen RISE programs work. You've seen the light switching when you're interacting with athletes and them going back out into the communities and sharing some of their stories. What more work can be done? If we can maybe limit our answers to a minute each, I'd love to get to each one of you. And Shannon, let's start with you.
Like I said, I didn't really get to experience RISE, but I got to see the kids and the staff from the year before and how when they came in, they immediately just connected, and that was pretty cool. I wish that there was more than just 10 weeks. I think if we can keep doing that throughout the year, or some component of it, or some follow through with the group of kids, I mean, the officers can take that upon themselves, obviously, but some kind of follow through where we can keep moving forward. I think RISE is an awesome program. It has a lot of good things that we can even utilize in our own police department with different programs that we're doing. And just advice to Jaiden and Renee, as you guys keep going, don't take no for an answer. And if they give you no, find a different way to ask it, and just keep pushing forward with what you're trying to do, because persistence always wins. So just keep doing that. So.
Great advice. Don't change the goal, change the way you approach achieving the
Yep.
goal. Luis, you've had some great experience in Chicago with RISE. If you had the ability to evolve the program in one aspect based on your learnings and your evolution, what might that look like?
Again, it's very apparent and obvious with the two wonderful athletes that we have here present today that they're very influential. They have an extremely large platform, and they're very effective in change. Not just these athletes that we have with us, but just across the whole gamut in sports. These athletes are looked upon between adults, youth, juvenile, everybody all together. If we could continue these partnerships and relationships, and not just on a 6-week or a month, or even just on a Q&A session, we relate and interact with the teams in our society, in our cities, and bond with them, have them come to our programs. Jaiden, you come down to Chicago, I'll get you there right along, buddy, not a problem. We also have a Citizens Police Academy where we could actually have athletes, professional athletes, go through the exact training that Jaiden was mentioning earlier. So there are definitely opportunities within Chicago Police Department, and I'm sure every other municipality as well. You just have to look into that so that we can learn a little bit more about them, bonding with them, seeing them on a regular basis, and then they could see and understand what we go through by going through our training and seeing what we see on a daily basis.
It's like you're reading my mind. That's the one thing, Jaiden, I love that idea. And Michael, I'm curious, in Detroit, how much conversation has there been, or maybe you guys are already doing this on a regular basis, where as you're trying to foster those relationships with community, whether it's with athletes or otherwise, there are those opportunities for ride-alongs and spend a day in the precinct and understand what it's like to be in our shoes, to be able to foster a different type of conversation.
So first, let me just say, like, bravo to Jaiden and bravo to Renee. Like, it's so amazing to see people out here that are not only, have the mentality of change, but are actually putting it into action and being effective with it. So it's really cool. So air claps to you both. That's amazing. I'll definitely follow you both on Instagram and check you out. As far as Detroit goes, we do a lot of those things that Luis just talked about and what Jaiden is alluding to. The ride-alongs, a day in the precinct, a day in the life of an officer. Those are things that are really important to us. But one thing, Jaiden, that I think you touched on that we found to be really interesting is scenario-based situations where we make you the police officer and then we'll switch the role. And when you give like a person that thinks, hey man, I know exactly how an officer he should, you know, knock the gun out of his hand or something first, and then we put them in the same exact situations with our tools. Oh man, it's such a mind twist that is really interesting to watch. So I agree with you that those are 100% ways that people grow and learn together. And one thing that I would say that it sounds like everybody's kind of on the same page with is just everybody's got a span of influence. And what I've learned just from living, from having been an athlete, from having been a police officer, from just being a person in the world, is that the only difference between a superhero and a supervillain is how they use their powers. And everybody is just kind of doing, you know, their stuff in a forward-thinking, amazing way. And for me, I think as we continue to go forward, and I think the mindset of police officers are shifting more toward community orientation, and the mindset of the community is really, you know, in some ways trying to understand what police officers may go through. I think that's, you know, the bridge that we're looking for.
That's so amazing. I need to write that down and like post that somewhere. The only difference between a superhero and a supervillain is how they use their power. Officers Crespo, Finis, Richardson, Renee, Jaiden, y'all made my life so daggone easy. I should send you all like flowers. What did we learn? The importance of empathy, the importance of listening, the importance of asking the question, how do you feel about that? All great tools for helping build bridges between communities and law enforcement. Thanks to all of you for sharing your amazing insight. RISE has all sorts of case studies and proof as to what is possible. And Diahann, I'd love to sort of wrap things up by sending it back to you and asking you to share some of the most critical points that you've gleaned from the Youth and Law Enforcement report that you've recently put out.
So one, I invite everyone to go check out the full law enforcement and community report. I think Andrew and his team have done a great job of kind of collating and pulling out great lessons from what we've done across cities, across the nation. And I think everyone can learn from it. We tried to make sure it's as straightforward as possible, as helpful as possible. I would highlight three main points that I think was said here, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor them, but one is to use sport as an incentive, right? We didn't talk about the commonality that sports offers that allows for this relationship to begin to be built. It's why RISE stays in the sports space. I don't think it's the only space where this can happen, but it lays that common ground so that you can start dealing with the more difficult conversations. So our report definitely says using sports as an incentive. People have tried programs like these. We don't think we're the first people to ever do it, but sports as an incentive provides the commonality and gets the young person involved and keeps them involved. Our third point is to tackle the hard topics strategically. The truth is, more than anything, that's what RISE is here for. I think that officers, I don't know how to be an officer, and I don't expect them to necessarily know how to put which topic should we go to now, how do we structure the activities, right? Like that's what we bring to the table. We're happy to do it, but it's very important to talk about the right things at the right time to have the greatest impact. And so we're excited to do that with more people. And to everybody's point, if y'all want to have RISE more than once, more than a 10-week session, that's not a problem. Just let us know. I mean, that's what I raise money for. I'd love to do it multiple times a year. Let's make it happen. Andrew has about 50 different modules, so don't worry about repeating information either. And then the third point I'm going to share from the report is nothing changes perceptions like positive interactions. Our young people are rational, often beautiful, and wonderfully intelligent beings, right? And the way to change their perception is to keep having positive interactions from them and with them. It's not what you say to them, it's what you do with them. It's that Officer Crespo keeps showing up. You keep showing up, so they miss you when you don't, right? And so there's nothing really that replaces positive interactions to change perceptions. We have some perceptions and realities we need to change, and we think this is the way to do it. Bonnie, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for leading this conversation. Everybody who came, I really appreciate you. We've been doing so much with this Rise Digital Learning Series, and I do think this conversation in the different ways we'll push out parts of it are really going to help the national conversation, because we need help.